What is going on? It's Daniel, Mr. Cuervo Racing. Today we are talking about issues with sealing mainly the copper head gaskets, some with chromatic head gaskets. So I'm going to show you one thing that is a concern that I ran into recently a couple of times with a few different customers. So if you're using studs or head bolts, on almost all the copper head gaskets, we use head studs. I'm going to show you what's happening with it using a head bolt. It's irrelevant in this situation, just for example. But I'm going to show you what is going on. So, as we have our cylinder, putting the gasket on top, let's see. This gasket is not the proper bore for this, but just an example of what we're looking at. So, okay, you put your gasket on, you put your copper coat or your sealant, whichever you're using, put your head on, and then you go to thread in your head bolts from the top. So, you have your sealant on there kind of tacking up, and let's say you take your oil. Let's see if it'll focus. You're like, okay, you're trying to do everything proper. Put a nice amount of oil on there, and you run that down. You're running that down. Everything's going good. You put your engine together, but you realize that you have a oil leak. What looks like an oil leak. Well, two things happen, or two things can happen, is if you pull that up, you can see there that you have a lot of oil that is in between your head gasket and the cylinder. So that is doing two things. To run that off of there, that is doing two things. Is one, if you have any type of sealant on here, the oil is going to not allow that sealant to properly cure. The oil itself is also going to stay in between the head gasket and the cylinder and push out slowly. It is also going to float the head gasket with that barrier from sealing properly against the cylinder or the head or both. So now you have a problem with oil leak without proper from there. Also potentially from this area here is fairly thin, so if that gasket didn't seat down properly, the sealant didn't cure properly, now you have an oil leak coming out of this area. Now this same problem applies for all four of, actually all six of your head bolts. These two here, the two coming up into the cylinder head, and the two over here. Now the two over here are not as big of a concern because they have dowels. Most of the oil will stay in the dowel and be separated from the head gasket, sealant, copper coat. So normally we see an issue here on this side, mainly because the cylinder on the engine is tilted and tends to drain into that area. So let's say you went and you put head studs. Let's see what we got. Okay, so assembly lube, doing the proper thing again. You're thinking, okay, we're going to put some assembly lube on here, and you put a good amount. You're doing the right thing. You're like, okay, that looks awesome. You run that down. Same problem, same thing. Now we have a thicker grease pushing out that has way more surface tension on it and viscosity, that's going to hold your head gasket up even higher. So same problem results. It pushes out, creates a barrier, creates a leak of some sort, disturbs the curing of the sealant. So with a head stud, with head bolts, you need to grease that in some aspect so you get proper torque. So the threads run smoothly through these threads and you're not causing resistance changing your torque spec. So when you're running head studs though, you don't really need to grease this side. You need to have just enough oil to where basically just wipe a little oil on it, wipe it clean with a rag, enough to where it has a little bit of coating, but fairly dry. So say like if you grab a white napkin and wipe it, you would see some residue on there, some color. But that when you do thread it down, it's going to be dry. So that's how we cure that issue. With head bolts, normally we're using the factory head gasket, which is not as much of a concern. It doesn't, the factory head gasket works extremely well. Doesn't have this same type of issue of how it is. I wish I had a gasket open at the moment. Let me see. Regardless of that. Okay, so when you do your head studs, you do need to grease the nut and the washer that's going to go on top with a good amount of grease down on the bottom, just enough to run those threads smoothly, because when this stud is all the way down, it's just stationary. You're not applying rotational torque to that. All the rotational torque is on the top side, your nut and washer there. So that is the issue I've ran into recently. That is what I recommend doing with it. Even using a light coat of WD-40, you do the same thing. A little bit of spray on there. I know it's such a simple thing, but it does cause issues. So that like that. Then when you thread it down, you're not going to get that oil pushing back out of that hole. So it's a simple thing that causes quite a bit of headache and concern that can be easily rectified. So that's what I have for today for you, and we will talk again soon.